Hey, welcome back. Step 3 of the mindset mastery process. Ready to dive in? Share my screen with you and we'll get started. Very critical, exciting talk today, an exploration. Today is all about becoming aware of our patterns of reaction. So before we get into the details of this outline, let's put in some context why we're looking at this. As we've touched on in the previous couple of talks, we recognize that indeed we are in reaction to the world. And not all of our reactions are very pleasant or positive or effective. Now, some of our reactions are internal. We have emotional reactions. We have thoughts that get going. And then some of our reactions are external in that we put them into action, perhaps as an outburst or an unnecessary argument, or somehow maybe giving somebody the silent treatment, some way of withdrawing. You've probably noticed over the course of your life that these automatic reactions get in the way of a lot of things. It gets in the way of you being happy, you being energized. It gets in the way of you accomplishing what you want to accomplish. And it gets in the way of you connecting with others in the way you'd like to connect, establishing the type of sustainable, trusting relationship that you'd like to have. So these reactions are quite destructive and sabotaging of our efforts in life. And they really hinder us. They really get in the way both of what we want to experience in life and in terms of what we want to accomplish in life. And of course, this is going to have a massive impact on our business pursuits. So the idea here with mindset mastery is that the more you become aware of why you're having the reactions you're having, the more elevation you get to your reactions, and therefore the more choice you give yourself. Now, we've touched on some of the explanations already, but we're going to go into much more detail here today. Now, step number one, or explanation number one, is that we have a biological foundation. And I think it's important to start with this notion that we're animals at the end of the day. Yes, we are not just animals. We have a psychology. We have a culture that we engage in that seems quite complex and sophisticated compared to what we perceive in the rest of the natural world. And to that extent, we're ontological creatures, meaning that we live lives of integrated meaning with each other. We wake up into meaningful situation. We're always embedded in a complex matrix of meaningful practices and meaningful understandings about the world, understandings about what's true, what's false, what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. Like, we don't have to suss that out and think about it every moment. We're just in it. It's just immediately apparent to us because we've been enculturated in it. And after so many years of reinforcement, it just shows up as a omnipresent whole. We don't have to, recreate it. in every moment. So to that extent, when you look at the human cultural life and the meaning, the sophisticated, meaningful game that we play, it's quite astounding and quite differentiated from the rest of the animal kingdom as far as we can tell. But nevertheless, we're still animals too. And this is important to realize, because my point is that part of the explanation for why you react in the way that you react, in this unconscious, automatic way, in ways that make you not really feel good, and if you act out of those, they produce results you're not really that happy with. Part of the explanation for that is simply that you're an animal. As an animal, you're gonna be afraid. That's built into the biological mechanism of every creature on Earth, as far as we know. We can't escape it, despite, you could say, our best efforts with all the accoutrements of civilization and all of the great literature and all of the psychological insights and even spiritual insights. Nevertheless, we still are stuck in these bodies, and these bodies have automatic functions that there's no way to turn off, and there's no way to absolutely control. Now, before we get into the negative aspects of that, let's, or at least we experience it as negative aspects, let's look at the positive aspect, and that is that a lot of our functions as a living being are handled for us without us having to think about it and rationally make choices from moment to moment. Thank goodness our breathing is just kind of automatically going, and it just takes care of itself, so to speak. Same thing with the circulation of our blood and the functioning of all our internal organs. And you can see this come into play, especially like if you scratch yourself or you scrape yourself. You start to notice quite quickly, although usually not as quickly as we'd like, your body's healing functions start going at work. It's kind of like sort of little nano creatures just kind of attacking that wound and healing it. And sure enough, in most cases, before you know it, your scrape is gone, your arm's as good as new, or whatever was scraped. So that's really wonderful. I mean, that would be pretty trying if we had to think that through, every moment. It's like, okay, now, go to work healing that part of my body, and we sort of had to keep our attention on that. I mean, you wouldn't be able to do anything else, right? So thankfully, a lot of our biological functions are self-regulated through our nervous system, and we don't have to track it. Now, the downside of that is in the fear component. The body is wired so as to survive. And you can imagine, whether it's God that set this up, or the cosmos, or a combination, or random, I don't know. But however it was set up, it probably makes good sense that you would put survival as the first priority, because I mean, without that, it's nothing else really becomes possible. I mean, I sort of try to imagine a world where creatures didn't care about their individual survival at all. And I just have this picture of absolute chaos of, uh, people walking off cliffs and so forth. And it just wouldn't work. Life couldn't sustain itself that way. So your body is designed such that you avoid threats that could possibly kill you. And just as a lot of your functions are regulated automatically, your fear response is also one of those functions. So some of you have looked into this already, and I won't go into great detail about it, but there's parts of our brain that are very old, very primitive in terms of evolution. Some call it the limbic system, the amygdala, and the limbic system together. In any case, the essence of it is that this part of our brain is designed to be very cautious and to be, how can I put it, kind of always be alert to the worst case scenario, and always be at the ready, because, in case. And this makes good sense, because as an animal, you can afford to make a mistake if the threat that you thought was a threat turns out not to be a threat, right? You thought that was a gigantic eagle that could come down and snatch you away, let's say, if you're a little kid, I don't know. But that turns out to be a cloud. Okay, that's, you can afford that. But what you can't afford is to make a mistake the other way, where it truly is an eagle, but your body says, no big deal. It might be a cloud. We don't really need to be too worried about it. Because just one of those mistakes and you're dead. You're gone. You're off the chessboard. You're not playing anymore. So you are designed in this same way. And so your fight, flight, freeze mechanism is automatically built in, and it activates at a moment's notice, at the slightest possible potential of threat. You're going to be thrown into this fear response. Now, if we look at that in terms of some of the details of it, what happens? Well, think about if you ever have felt like you were really just threatened. I mean, possibly in a physical level, but even on a social level, have you ever just felt so panicked and afraid of some situation? And you're typically your hands get moist. Your face might start getting hot. You get hot under your arms. Your whole body, in a way, starts heating up. Your stomach can start to churn a little bit. You notice you have to go to the bathroom more. So that's your body's way of letting go of the waste, so that if you do need to run, if you do need to fight, you're at your leanest and meanest and ready to give your best. Now those feelings of blushing and nausea and just sweating, for most of us, those are not pleasant experiences. And We wish in most cases we could avoid them. But the point here is that it's a part of life and it just comes with having a body. So we have the same patterns that every other animal has, and there's nothing we can do about it. There's a story about Darwin, actually, that I think illustrates this pretty well. One day, as he was working on his theories, he decided to go to the museum. There was a natural history museum where he was in England, I think, and there was a cobra there, a live cobra. And he would go up, it was in a glass case, and he would go up to the case and he wanted to see when the cobra struck the case with its fangs, would he be able to somehow just not flinch and be stoic about it? Well, sure enough, that snake struck and he just responded like that. And he thought, okay, well, maybe if I do this enough times, I'll become more calm about it. So he went back day after day after day. I don't know exactly how many days he went back, but quite a lot. He reports that he could never turn this response off, that that snake struck that glass and he would just automatically flinch in some way. Well, you could say poor Darwin, but I think the point is we would all do the same thing, and we all do the same thing. All right, now we've begun to touch on this a little bit. See, now here's where the real trouble starts, because as human beings, because of that complex social matrix of meaning that I was referring to earlier, we have invented a character to play, a self that we play in the social sphere, in the public sphere, so that we're as interested in protecting that public social self as we are in protecting our biological self. Did you with me there? So that this is a critical move that I want you to make with me now. So we're saying first and foremost that we're already stuck in this biological body that is hardwired to survive, to protect the biological creature that we are. And the way that it protects us doesn't take any chances. It's automatically regulated. The slightest hint of peril, we're going to respond with the threat response and all of that, the hotness and nausea and so forth. Now, human beings have taken that hardwired biological mechanism and applied it to our social selves. So think of your social self as kind of like your avatar that you play in the video game of life. So you get this sense, right? Like, yeah, you have you, the body you understand that, but then there's a you that the character you play in the game of life. In my case, I'm this guy, John, this American guy who at this point lives in California, who is a father, a teacher, a brother, a sweetheart to someone, and many other things, a curious person, an athlete, so on and so forth. So now any piece of that character which I identify with that gets threatened, my biological limbic system is going to turn on and I'm going to have that fear response. So you can see that the potential for threat has now skyrocketed for human beings. I don't know if it's correct, strictly speaking, to say it's exponentially greater, but in any case, I think it's infinitely greater. It's almost incomprehensible how many threats suddenly can emerge when you not only are protecting the biological creature, but you're protecting the social avatar character that you play. So, you know, most creatures in the world, they're probably, they're not thrown off by, oh, you know, like that fellow deer gave me a dirty look, you know, or they gave me some body language that indicated they were slighting me, or you know, they were running too far ahead of me, and you know, I feel like they don't respect me. I I don't think that's what's going on out there. But for us, we have all of this. So it could be the slightest thing, you know, just a raised eyebrow could be a threat. The tone of someone's voice, things that people don't say that we expect them to say. You know, how many negative reactions have you had to a text or an email? It's not even the person talking to you face to face, it's just words on a screen. Nevertheless, those words are, you perceive them as an attack on who you are. So the same hard wiring, this, and you could say the same programming that's deeply embedded in our being to protect us biologically has now been deployed to protect us socially. Okay. just right now, just be in discovery about this. Just, you know, your brain might throw up thoughts of, you know, what are we going to do about this? How do I fix this? Just look, right now, the way to deal with it is to become aware of it. That's going to be your release. The more aware you are, the more clarity you have, the more power you're going to have. Now, your specific triggers are correlated with how you perceive the world. So now let's bring in the cultural aspect of this, the specific cultural training that we all get. To some extent, the culture that we grow up in and that we're immersed in teaches us what is a social threat and what isn't a social threat. Or in other words, what's dangerous and what isn't dangerous. I'll just give you a relatively trivial example, I suppose, but when you're in the middle of it, it doesn't seem so trivial. I noticed a few years ago, some years back, I was in Colombia, I think Bogota, Colombia. Beautiful city. Very, very beautiful city. I was driving around with a friend of mine. He was actually driving. And I noticed that, how can I put this? There was a lot of aggression, not only in the way he drove, but pretty much everybody else. And when we were in the city, the the amount of cutting in front of each other, and you know, it was incredible, and like any slight possible way that you could get some advantage over the other driver to get ahead, you know, a foot, people seemingly were doing it. But here's the interesting thing. I noticed that my friend, he was never offended by what anybody did. I was sitting there, I was sort of pale and just kind of frazzled. I was fear for his life, given some of the things he was doing that I thought would be offensive to other people. But as far as I can tell, the other drivers didn't affect them at all. And then when they would do similar moves, it didn't bother him. He wasn't activated about it at all. And then I thought about us in America. I'm sure I'm generalizing, but I noticed for a lot of Americans, we take the moves that people do on the road so personally. It just offends our sensibilities that somebody would aggressively try to get ahead of us or something. So you know there's a lot of so-called road rage in America. So that's just an example of where the culture has different understandings of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so as an individual, you're going to be brought up in that, and you're going to fall into place on that understanding. Another example would be the opportunity to sing in public. But you know, for most of us, we're going to get pretty worried about that and pretty anxious about that prospect. But I imagine for a lot of people who grow up in a so-called showbiz family where there's lots of parties in their childhood and lots of sing-alongs with people, and maybe even they start becoming child models pretty soon, and then child actors or you know, beat school plays and stuff like that. I could imagine a showbiz kid becoming fairly immune to fear and panic in terms of singing in public. You know, that they might just be quite calm about it. So there again, it's some of why you react the way you react is just how you were raised, where you were raised, and the understanding of being in that area and that family, that community. So what's embarrassing and what's considered rejection are largely culturally based. Okay, so that you could see when we talk about the social self, the point is there's some variation. With the biological self, it's all the same, right? I mean, you got a tiger growling 10 feet away from you. I think your biological system's going to kick into place no matter where you're from. I don't know. I suppose if you're around tigers all the time, some of that might calm down a little bit. But for the most part, we're all going to respond fairly similarly to biological threats. but socially, that social character that we are, I think we have variations in terms of the way we respond, the way we respond to the world. Because again, our culture sort of shows us what's embarrassing and what's rejection. You know, talking about cultures is always a little bit fraught because people can see the examples as stereotypical and things like and that's I don't want to do that, and I don't think in those terms. I'm just trying to say things in a way that you can relate to it. So I'll, with that proviso in place, or that caveat in place, I'll just say that, at least traditionally speaking, I have a sense of Japanese as being hypersensitive to, what would I call it? Dishonoring of their value. Perhaps they have refined that particular understanding of what it means to be respected and honored in a way that maybe in a lot of the US, we don't have it quite that refined. So, you know, you could imagine an American going to Japan and possibly sort of socially stumbling here and there because they don't understand the finer points of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Okay, you get the point. Now you can learn to see through some of this, and I think that begins to give you a little bit more freedom. So when you can see that, you know, what my culture has taught me is valid, certainly, and yet it's not necessarily the objective absolute truth of the way the world is. It's just an understanding that's been put together, and it has a lot of agreement around it right now. And you'll notice even within a given culture, beliefs about what's dangerous and what's not dangerous can evolve over time. So when you see that, it can perhaps give you some pause. Now, I think if you've been raised in such a way that your tendency is to be nervous at the prospect of singing, that's going to be hard to eradicate completely, because that's just, it's the water you swim in. But you can have a somewhat of a pause and somewhat of a diminishment of the fear when you realize, oh, okay, the reason I'm feeling this is that's just the water I swim in. That's the cultural understanding in which I was brought up in. It's been programmed into me. Okay. And then, you know, it doesn't necessarily eliminate it and make it go away, but I think you're not as controlled by it, as overwhelmed by it. Now, I think your genetics also has an impact. You could say that's another way of talking about the biological piece, but it's a specific piece of the puzzle. And the thing is that our genetics, apparently, from what I understand from the literature, is that it impacts not only how we look and how tall we are and our propensity for various ailments and diseases and so forth. But it also has an impact on our personality, our actual way of showing up in the world is also impacted by our genetics. So you may notice that you tend to be agreeable, or you're not as agreeable as most people. That's not necessarily a bad thing either way, but it's built into you genetically. And another way that we sometimes slice our characterizations is extroverted and introverted. That's in your DNA. It's out of your control to some extent. Now, from moment to moment, can an introvert show up in an outgoing way? Of course. Can an extrovert show up in a quiet, reserved way? Of course. But the propensity and the momentum of how you're going to normally tend to show up is somewhat determined by your genetics. As I say, this is hard to assess accurately. You can imagine it's you're talking about human lives here. It's not that easy to set up controlled experiments that can give you reliable results. But the experiments they have done on twins have been quite revealing in this regard. But to what extent how we show up, to what extent our personality is based on the nurturing we've received, and to what extent it's based on our genetics, I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows exactly how to draw that line. But it's pretty much agreed that genetics has some place in the explanation. Now, we're talking about how your specific triggers are correlated with how you perceive the world. The last aspect that we'll point to is your individual biography. In addition to being a part of a world of meaning within your culture and your community, you've also had your own life. And so you've had your own experiences. Things have occurred. You've had a unique experience of life that nobody else could possibly have had. Now, again, the literature, as I understand it, will tell you that your patterns begin at a very young age. And babies form strategic patterns of reaction. And it's based on what works that's going to help them survive. And your mind is organized to see relevant patterns, relevant in the sense that those patterns help you survive. This all starts kicking in right away. This doesn't wait till your brain is fully formed as an adult. This starts very early. Now, to some extent, we have a shared biography because, of course, we're all born into the world. And as far as it goes right now, you must come into the world through your mother, whether it's a natural birth or cesarean birth. You're brought into the world. You were previously within your mother's body and integrated with her body, and then you're brought out into the wider world. a lot starts happening in very quick succession. And right away, the baby has to survive right away. You know, when you're inside your mother, your survival's taken care of. You don't have to really, you don't have to do anything. Everything's automatic. As soon as you're born, your nervous system, your brain system, it all has to start getting into quick gear, because your mother's not going to automatically take care of it. So right there, there's a sense, there's a sense of like, I'm alone, and I have to take care of myself. I have to do what I need to do so I can exist. So I think precognitively, the baby starts figuring that out pretty much immediately. And so you start eating right away with your mother's milk. And as a little time goes on, you have certain needs that crop up, like being warm, being cleaned up, and primarily being fed, and to some extent sleeping. Pretty simple needs, you could say. But you start, we all do, start managing this process to make sure that it works for you. And any moment that you're hungry and the food isn't right there, your survival mechanism kicks in place. The babies are wired to start crying and screaming and make themselves known. Now you could imagine for the baby themselves, that's probably not too pleasant of an experience. You ever seen a baby when they're screaming their heads off for some reason? This doesn't look contentment. This doesn't look pleasurable. This looks excruciating. But so be it. They need to survive, and they need to get someone's attention because they can't do it on their own. So they're crying out for help, and they're damn serious about it, and it needs to happen damn well right now, or they're gonna they're gonna explode further and further and further with rage until you get it. Now, what you see with all of this is that survival is our number one priority. This starts from an early age. It's hardwired into us. Slowly but surely, we develop our individual personalities, this individual avatar, the self that we're going to be in the world. And the same survival mechanism gets deployed into that. So a lot of life, it triggers us because our fear-based mechanism has been so deeply embedded and so deeply reinforced, so that it's like a tidal wave that's just takes us over. Now, with mindset mastery, you're getting clarity about this. So now part of this is like kind of just take a deep breath and let it go and kind of give yourself a break, sort of relieve yourself of some of the blame you've put on yourself and some of the pressure you've put on yourself. Pressure to be in control, always be a good person, and always be happy, and always be productive. Look, there's forces at work here that are beyond your will. They're beyond any of our wills to control. This is a very valuable insight to get. Now, I understand it doesn't fix it all in this moment. It doesn't eliminate the emotional and mental negative reactions that get in the way of your happiness and your productivity. But I'm telling you, it's all going to add up. It's all going to add up. And through this clarity, through this awareness, through this understanding, you're going to be able to be much more the manager of yourself. You're going to get to a place where you are not acting on the basis of your historical reaction machine. And you're going to learn to relax and embrace and kind of accept the fear that's going to keep coming up for you. And when you realize the fear is not based on the external world per se, it's because of the way you're designed to respond to the external world. It's really your design that's the culprit here. It's if you add it all up, right? Your fear-based limbic system, your DNA, the cultural matrix you've been born in, plus your biology of surviving from moment to moment, especially as a young child, all of that has added up to produce this fear-based mechanism in which you're immersed. Just knowing that is, I think, a big relief. And you can take away some of the pressure you put on yourself. And eventually, as I say, eventually we're going to get you to the place where you can hold your fear in such a way that your fear doesn't have you, but instead you have your fear. And I know that might just sound like semantics, but it's actually an incredibly distinct difference of experience. So we're in the perfect place. Stay with it. Stay in discovery. Keep thinking about it. Keep making this all real for you. None of this is of that much value just as philosophy or theory. So you'll notice as I do these talks, I'm really talking to you personally, and I'm inviting and imploring you to make this real for yourself. And some of that happens when we're together on this video, but some of it happens before and after when you go off into your life and you continue the discovery process. All right, very good. We'll see you next time. Good work.